Yo, what is up, my beautiful people? As you can probably tell by the tone of my voice, I'm extremely happy. And that's because the Warriors take down the Celtics 107-88 in typical Warriors fashion. My goodness gracious, was this a great game to watch as a Warriors fan. It was encouraging to see, man. Especially after a somewhat embarrassing loss in game 1 after they had the lead, which I kind of spoke about in depth on the last episode. But yeah, watching the game the other night gave me a little bit of confidence as to how this series is going to go. I think in game 1 we didn't expect the aggression from the Boston Celtics, especially within that last quarter of the game. And typically when something like that happens to you, you tend to lose your confidence because they, like I said, are a seasoned team. They know what they're doing. And when you lose a lead so carelessly, it could shake your mental state in all different kinds of places. But they didn't let that happen. They showed their grit and determination and they got the job done. So without further ado, let's get into that. There's a couple notes that I took down, and I think the best way to approach this episode is, again, doing it in a format of why the Celtics lost and why the Warriors won. I think that's the best way to do it in my opinion. So, we'll start off with why the Warriors won. To me, the outstanding factor was their defensive tenacity. I thought they played with energy and aggression straight from the opening tip. Like, you could really see it. I think it was maybe 10 to 15 seconds within the game. Draymond Green caused a jump ball against Al Horford by smothering him. So, I think that really set the tone defensively that it wasn't going to be as sloppy as a game as game 1 was. And you could see that the game was going to be quite chippy for the entire 48 minutes. And we'll get into other defensive aspects, other players in particular, like Gary Payton II, which I will mention in a little bit. But yeah, it was just impressive to me that straight out of the gate, they made sure that they set the tone and made their presence felt, if that makes any sense. But I think you could really tell that Draymond took the responsibility of defense on his shoulders when reflecting on game 1 and how his performance was. As I mentioned in the previous episode, yes, he did grab 11 rebounds. But in the press conference, it seemed like he wasn't happy with his overall impact on the game, which I respect because he rectified it and look, we came out with a win, a blowout win. So, respect to Draymond for that. Respect for making the defensive adjustments that we need to make. Moving on to my second reason, their intensity on offense. Watching the game, I felt like the majority of Warriors players were constantly driving to the rim. Albeit, there were a few smoke layups, which I want to address in the summary at the end of the episode. But overall, I enjoyed watching them trying to initiate contact and just kind of making sure that the Celtics knew that they weren't just a 3-point shooting team like a lot of people who watch the NBA would lead you to believe. You know, we have some skilled rim runners like Andrew Wiggins, Steph, arguably, and Jordan Poole, arguably. So it was just nice to see them not settling for shots that they're known for to keep the defense guessing, and it ultimately turned out in their favor. And you could see the impact that it had not only on Warriors players, but Celtics defenders. I think three key players for the Celtics: Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, and Robert Williams. It might be Grant Williams, so correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. But yeah, point being, those three guys who are anchors defensively, especially Jaylen Brown, you could tell that it was sort of getting into their psyche a little bit how many fouls we were drawing. And that kind of thing affects the overall flow of a game. Not only do you have to think about your performance on the defensive end of the floor, but you also have to think about your performance on the offensive side. What do I mean by that? Is you cannot be too over aggressive and get an illegal screen call or a charge call, even worse. So you could kind of see the thought process going through Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum's heads in particular, because they are so offensively driven for the Celtics. So that was impressive to me, just how they were able to handle the contact despite the Celtics, as I said, being known as a great defensive team. It kind of showed to the Celtics that they're not afraid of trying to break their defensive schemes down by constantly attacking the rim. Whilst we're on the topic of defense, let's talk about a key player that's been absent for about a month or just over. Gary Payton II. If that name rings a bell to you, Seattle Supersonics. Gary Payton. Look him up if you haven't. One of the best defenders of all time. And you can tell that his son, Gary Payton, I was about to say junior, but I don't want to say junior because I find that a little bit disrespectful to the man. Gary Payton II, you could tell that he clearly has his father's genes. And I would argue, maybe even a little bit better than his dad's. Might be a hot take, might not be. Not on the defensive side of the ball, of course, because he's Hall of Famer guaranteed in that end. But I would say that Gary Payton II is more gifted offensively. And the reason why I say this is, if you watch some of Gary Payton's play, he is known for defense. And in terms of offensive ability, he never really had the slashing ability that Gary Payton II does. And if you don't know about why Gary Payton II has been out for so long, in the Western Conference semis, Gary Payton II went up for a dunk, got absolutely clobbered, and I mean that in the politest way possible, because in my opinion it was a little bit of a dirty play. But he got absolutely clobbered by Dylan Brooks. And on the way down, he landed kind of awkwardly, sort of bracing himself on the ground. And then he came out with an elbow injury. Now, with all that being said, I'm really impressed with how he played, because you could really tell that the team needed him for defense. And you could feel his immediate impact as soon as he checked into the game. You know, like the Warriors fans gave him a standing ovation as soon as he got called onto the floor. That brings so much energy to not only the overall morale in the stadium, but to the players out on the floor as well. Because let's face it, apart from Draymond Green, there isn't really an elite defender. I guess you could make the case for Andrew Wiggins because he stepped up his performance over the couple of years that he's been at Golden State. but Draymond Green is really the nitty-gritty Marcus Smart version that the Celtics have for the Warriors. And it's been like that for a long time, but it's good to see that he cares just as much about defense as he does offense. Even though the Warriors are one of the best teams in terms of defense in the league. I don't know what exact number, but I think we're top 5. Correct me if I'm wrong again. But we are known for defense somewhat, contrary to popular belief. So that's the defensive side. We've eaten all our vegetables, kids. So let's move on to the best part of the meal, the fat, juicy steak, which I like to call offense. So how could we not start off this segment without talking about the leader of the team, in my opinion, Stephen Curry's 29-point performance in Game 2. Now, for most casual fans, you would probably think, and it's quite hypocritical of me to say, because I know that I did mention in the last episode that Stephen Curry should have given more of an offensive output in Game 1. But I promise, guys, I'm not a casual fan. I'm not as intellectual about basketball as some of the other people on this platform. But I'm not a casual fan. Let's just, get that right off the bat. Sorry, a little bit of a tangent there. Had to be defensive about my case. But yeah, most casual fans would say that Steph did not have a good game when compared to his output in Game 1. Because admittedly, those thoughts ran through my head watching the majority of the first quarter, where he only finished with 10 points. And he had quite a slow start, if I remember correctly. He wasn't really hitting the regular shots that you're used to seeing, and he even smoked a few layups as well. So naturally, I can understand from a casual fan perspective that you would say that, because he obviously didn't come out guns blazing from behind the arc. But realistically, hitting 6 threes in a game, let alone the first quarter, is a hard task to ask of anybody in the league. So I think it just goes to show Steph Curry's offensive greatness, really, that you would think as a casual fan that if he doesn't score over 30 points, that he had a bad game. But in my opinion, this game was a better performance from him all around, which is why I say it was better than his performance in Game 1. And I can already hear it in my head, because I know that most of the people thinking these thoughts will not put it down in the comments below. But why? You can't call us idiots and then not explain yourself, blah 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 blah. So young children, let me explain myself. The biggest reason why I think he had a better Game 2 than he did at Game 1 was that he let the game come to him. Now, what do I mean by this? If you guys have watched the Draymond Green show, he said the same thing. And I agree with it. What this means is not forcing anything. Usually when players have a performance like Steph Curry did in Game 1, they would typically try to replicate it because just in terms of the rhythm, I feel like people think that they can carry it over into the next game. And in all fairness, Steph could have very well done that. He could have hunted for switches onto big men, caused isolation plays, and gotten his points the way we are used to seeing. And it could have been a more entertaining show, I'll give you that. But it's not who Steph Curry is. And that's the number one thing that I respect about him the most. And quite frankly, this organization the most. Selfless basketball. Trusting your teammates to make the right plays. And although he is the offensive anchor to this team, they will find him in the right moments. And in all fairness, you could see when they started building up their leads a little bit, that Steph's confidence grew to the point where he did want to do an isolation play on Al Horford and basically take his ankles and shoot the three in front of his face. But that came over time, which is natural to a player who gets into the offensive flow of the game rather than forcing the issue. And you never really know. It's kind of a coulda, woulda, shoulda situation here. But you never really know how that scenario would have turned out if he made that decision. But if you are in the basketball world, you would kind of know the lingo of live or die by the three. So I felt like if Steph Curry was to put on that kind of performance, it would not only be detrimental to him, but to the rest of the team as well. So, in my opinion, I think we might have lost the game if he tried to play the same way that he did in Game 1. And that's not giving discredit to his offensive abilities because if you know him, you know what he's capable of. So of course, that's no disrespect. But yeah, I just really liked how he embodied what the Warriors franchise is really about, which is ball movement and selfless play. And you can see it when people leave Golden State. The one example I'll give is Harrison Barnes. When he left Golden State, he was all of a sudden 1,000 times better than he was with the Warriors. I never really liked Harrison Barnes. I'm going on a little bit of a tangent here. But the point I'm trying to make is once the Warriors system gets into you, it's kind of hard to shake off. And I feel like it improves players for the most part. Another example being JaVale McGee. He was once known as a scrub in the league. As soon as he joined the Warriors, became a champion then and there. Went on to a couple other teams. I think he's on the Suns now. And he's doing really well for himself. So give the system credit where it's due. We could also talk about Andrew Wiggins. But you can kind of see where I'm going with this. So we're not going to cover this any further. That was a little bit of a tangent by me. Let's go back on topic. Reason number 2, in terms of offense, is Mr. Jordan Poole, people. If you don't know the name, get to know the name. Because he will be the face of the Warriors as soon as Steph, Clay, and Draymond leave the league. That is my promise to you. And he proved that he's next in line. After having a shaky performance in Game 1, like I mentioned in the previous episode, he came out and scored 17. And again, to most casual fans, 17 isn't that great of a game. But for a bench player to score 17 in the NBA Finals without his confidence being shaken up from the last game, It's going to be a scary league once the veterans are out and Jordan Poole can take over this franchise. I promise you. Mark my words, I'll put any amount of money on it. Jordan Poole, Jordan Poole, Jordan Poole. And it would be stupid of me, absolutely stupid of me, not to mention his just above half court bomb at the end of the third quarter. Like, come on. If you don't already see Steph Curry in this young kid, you're blind. You're honestly blind. And yeah, just a little side note as well. I liked how happy Steph was for Jordan as soon as he hit that half court. I think it gave him flashbacks of how he used to be, you know? Not saying that he's not capable of doing it right now, because of course he is. But it's a good sign that the Warriors are in safe hands. Some honorable mentions before we move on to the last offensive point as to why the Warriors won the game. Two people. Gary Payton II, who I've already mentioned, and Nemanja Bjelica. I probably butchered that name, but let's move on. Gary Payton II. The reason why I'm mentioning him is from the box score, you probably don't think that he had a good game. He only scored 7 points, I believe. But to not be known as an offensive player in terms of shooting, and then to go and shoot 2 corner threes in front of the Celtics bench is incredible. Especially in his first game back, where you would kind of see most players trying to gain their legs, if you want to call it that, under them, trying to gain their offensive rhythm back because of all the time that they've missed. So although it wasn't the biggest scoring output, it was one that impacted them quite beneficially because he had his imprint on both sides of the floor. Anyways, moving on to Bjelica. The same goes with him. He didn't really play super big minutes in the game, I'll be honest with you. But from what I saw from him on the time that he was out on the floor was insane. Now again, the man only scored 6 points. But he was active off the ball, screening, cutting, and when he had the ball in his hands, he made the right reads. Although he had 1 or 2 careless turnovers trying to make a pass where the defense could clearly read it, he overall was making the right play. And the reason why I'm mentioning his name is because he made the most of his opportunity out on the floor. He only played 11 minutes, but in my opinion, he fought for every single minute. And up until the point where he kind of banged up his knee, he was out on the floor hustling. So, respect to Bjelica. Sorry to the family if I've disrespected your family name. I promise I'll try and get it better next time. But that brings us on to our second half of the episode, why the Celtics lost. My first point, and we'll kind of take this in chronological order because that's how my notes were. Point number 1, I think they lacked offensive rhythm. And it was kind of evident in the first. Now, if you watch the game, you might disagree with me because they opened up the quarter, I think the score was 13-5. So any person with eyes and ears would be like, no, you're wrong. They were up. They established the tone from the jump. But here's where it becomes a little bit of a sticky situation. I can't sit there and say that they found offensive rhythm when the only 2 active people on the floor were Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, who are their 2 main stars and who are people you rely on giving offense to you. there was no other player, in my opinion, in the first who really stood out to me. Now, with that being said, Jason Tatum had a much better game than he did in Game 1. He only scored 12 points in Game 1, and he came out and scored 28 in this game. So kudos to him for figuring out his offense in that regard. But like I said, I'm a person who really likes to watch selfless basketball, ball movement, and all that other stuff because it gets your teammates involved, and arguably, it could make them want to do things on the other side of the floor. Because if you're not getting your touches on the ball, I think that it would discourage you from playing the arguably boring part of the game, which is defense. That's quite an amateur thing of me to say because, they're obviously professional athletes who get paid to do the job that they are supposed to do. So, of course, they always have to give 100% on defense all the time. But really and truly, I'll stand by that statement any day of the week. You want to make sure that you have an offensive output, no matter how big or small. Because once you see that ball go in the hoop, it encourages you to play the whole game, which is offense and defense. But yeah, in my personal opinion, I just felt like the Celtics offense went back to their old ways pre-Marcus Smart calling them out. And what I mean by this is running through two players, Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum. And so when the ball eventually did come to the other players on the court, they weren't able to capitalize on their situation because they had no feel for the ball on the court. They couldn't make the shots because they haven't had enough attempts. So that's my thing. And to that point, I think that's what's really going to get the Warriors over the edge in this series is the fact that they understand that in order to make winning plays, they have to sacrifice what they are used to. Because at the end of the day, basketball is a team sport, as you guys all know. But if the Celtics have done it before, taking them to one of the top spots in the East after the All-Star break, of course they're going to pull it together within this series. I have no doubt about it, but that's just one of the things that I noticed, particularly in the first half. The second thing, which might raise some concerns for Celtics fans going forward, Jason Tatum's apparent shoulder injury. I don't know if any of you guys saw that while watching the game, but I think it was late in the first quarter or early in the second. You could kind of see him rotating his shoulder, trying to get his rotator cuff stretched out. So I think on one of the plays he must have bumped into a defender, which caused him to re-aggravate a recent shoulder injury that he had. So just be on the lookout for that. That was a quick little short point, but important nonetheless. Now, remember what I said last episode about Marcus Smart? Well, I'm going to say it again if you don't. When he's good, he's great. But when he's bad, he's terrible. And that's what Marcus Smart was in Game 2. I thought he was absolutely terrible. And I think he bit off more than he could chew. What I mean by this is he tried to do too much when he's not that guy. Like, it's as simple as that. I think he really tried to force the issue and become the point guard that a typical point guard is. But what he has to realize is that he's not that gifted of a quote-unquote point guard who can shoot, score, and most importantly, play make. Marcus Smart has and never will be known as a guy who can play make. And as harsh as that is, that's just facts. Over the course of the game, I think particularly in the first and second quarter, Marcus tried to make a lot of reads that weren't necessarily there. However, what I will say is that if he had made the play a slight second earlier, I could see the potential for the pass going through, because you could see the window that he was trying to push it through. But maybe it's sort of the way he passed it or the time that he passed it. It was an easy read for the defense. And from an outsider's perspective, it kind of looked a little bit too flashy, if you want to call it that. Too extravagant and too difficult for his skill set in particular. So I think going forward, Marcus Smart should really be a catch and shoot player if he wants to be effective offensively for the Boston Celtics and bring his presence really on the defensive side of the floor, which I thought he did quite well, if I'm honest. But to my point, you could tell that he's not really an offensively gifted player because he only scored 2 points. So yeah, that's that. Also, as an honorable mention, I did kind of briefly explain it before, but 3 players in the Celtics lineup were in foul trouble in the first quarter, and I feel like that really impacted their chances on winning this game. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into it, but like I said, it affects offensive rhythm definitely, and their overall aggression had to be toned down a little bit, despite Jason Tatum going off, shooting over people, doing Kobe-esque fadeaways. Like, that was amazing to see as a fan of basketball in general. Just how gifted of an offensive player Jason Tatum really is. That being said though, if they didn't get into as much foul trouble as they did, do I think they win the game? Absolutely not. But, sorry Glenn, absolutely not. But I feel like they would have made it a more entertaining game. Because if you've been noticing over the past 30-ish minutes that I've been talking, I haven't mentioned the third or fourth quarter. The reason why I'm not mentioning those 2 quarters is because we absolutely obliterated the Boston Celtics. And that's not even an exaggeration to say that. We absolutely obliterated them. We sent them home. And now it's on to Boston for Game 3. Ime Udoka, the head coach, he waved the white flag by the start of the 4th, I think, or late in the 3rd. So it's kind of ironic how those 2 periods of the game was one reason why the Warriors lost and another reason why the Celtics lost. So as I said before, we blew them out in typical Warriors fashion, and if you don't know what that is, it's basically a classic ass kicking in the 3rd quarter. The 3rd quarter is where we make most of our runs, and this was even pre the whole Kevin Durant dynasty kind of thing. I think the Warriors as a franchise established their skill at closing out games as early as the 3rd quarter. The final reason before we wrap things up and I give my summary of the game as to why I think the Celtics lost this one was for the same reason I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, defense. Not just from Draymond Green, but everybody's defensive effort overall culminated in a massive win. If you listen to the last podcast, you would know that Al Horford, Derek White and Marcus Smart combined for 15 of 23 shooting from the 3-point line in Game 1. This time, however, I'm going to point to Derek White and Al Horford in particular. They combined for 2 for 7. So that is a massive, massive difference when you talk about offensive efficiency and overall impact on the basketball game. And like I said, it's a team sport. So when two of your, I wouldn't say key guys, like Derek White, as important as he is, he's not a key guy. Al Horford arguably is. But to my point, when you see those two guys struggling, it's kind of hard to get any offensive production out of anybody else on that team. And that's no disrespect to their lineup, especially when you talk about guys like Peyton Pritchard. But overall, the team is generally weaker if the starting group don't perform as well. I think that goes for any team, not just the Boston Celtics, by the way. But yeah, I think this showed more than anything the Warriors learning from their mistakes that they made in Game 1, making sure that even if players were able to get a shot off, that it was heavily contested, which is something that I think they really lacked in Game 1, and it was evident by the amount of three-pointers they were able to make over the course of that game. So they made the adjustment and showed more fight on the defensive end, in my opinion. And before we move on to my summary of the game and the overall wrapping up of this episode, I just want to give a kudos to Steph Curry for making sure that he wasn't being bullied on defense. Yes, I know that there were still some plays where he was getting shot over by the offensive player, but you can't really help that. The thing that I was really happy to see was the fact that he stood his ground and made sure that there was still a body in front of the offensive player, regardless of who that was. Now, majority of the time, he was being hunted out by Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, but he did a good job of not automatically forcing the switch off of him. I think he took it on the chin, whether they scored or not, that it was his task to defend them. So, that's something encouraging to see. As we approach the end of the episode, this is the part where I summarize my thoughts of the game and just a few concerns that I have going forward. I think that the Warriors have to clean up a little bit on their offensive sets that they run, because I saw a lot of not careless turnovers, but sloppy turnovers, if you want to call it that. And although it wasn't as much as the Celtics accumulated over the course of the game, because ultimately the Warriors did have a way higher points off turnover ratio when compared to the Boston Celtics, but that still doesn't give them the leeway to be making sloppy mistakes in the finals. I think they just need to tighten up their passing, not throw so many reckless hook shots or some of the flashier stuff that you would probably see in a regular season game. I also wanted to emphasize a point that I made in last episode, which was the fact that the Boston Celtics are clearly a better defensive team in terms of length, and you could see that in the first quarter it was getting into the Warriors' overall decision making and shot selection. As I said before, they did miss a few wide open layups, not even from Steph himself, but I think Andrew Wiggins, who is primarily known as a slasher, you could say, he smoked a lot of them too. I think the Warriors missed a total of 5 open layups. Not necessarily open, but what you would consider point blank range for an NBA athlete standard. They missed 5 of them throughout the first and second quarter, and it seemed like they were honestly scared of getting their shot blocked. So is that still a concern? Absolutely. Moving on to the next point, Klay Thompson. Now, if you've noticed, I haven't mentioned him throughout the entirety of the podcast, and the reason why is he didn't show up for Game 2, which is normal. He's still trying to get his legs under him, but it is concerning that, 2 games in, he still has yet to find an offensive rhythm. And if you heard the commentary over the third and fourth quarter, when they started to build that lead up, the commentators were basically mentioning that Steve Kerr is keeping Clay in just so that he can find his shooting stroke in the hopes that he will perform better next game. But in my opinion, I think that was the completely wrong move, because when you talk about the importance of longevity, Klay Thompson is the ideal person you should be talking about, especially with regards to the Golden State Warriors. I personally think it was a stupid decision, because the reason why I thought it was dumb was because why would you have somebody out on the floor who suffered from a ACL injury in the finals 2 years ago? Not only that, but an Achilles injury. So 2 devastating bottom half, some would say career-ending injuries. Why would you have him there when you're blowing out the team by damn near 30 points? It didn't make any sense. And the person who I'm going to point to is, you guessed it, Derrick Rose. Derrick Rose is one of those prospects who could have been way better than he is right now had he not been on the court in garbage time. So whilst I respect Steve Kerr's perspective on getting him to feel the ball out a little bit more, from what I saw in the quarters that he played, he didn't even have that much offensive impact. He didn't touch the ball much, really. He wasn't involved in the offense too much. So essentially, he was just doing suicides up and down the court. And when you've played that much of a game while still playing defense, I think there is more leeway to a potential injury by playing somebody in garbage time minutes. And at the end of the day, you still run practice the next day or the next 2 days, whatever the case may be. You will still run practice and he will still get his shots up. Uncontested shots, might I add. And on top of that, Steph didn't play a single minute in the first quarter. So when you think about the dynamic duo of Steph and Klay, if his brother goes down, that's half of the offense missing. So if you're going to give Curry that treatment of not playing the fourth quarter, do not play Klay by any means. Now, we're of course going to address the controversy before we go. But before that, I wanted to talk about Draymond Green. As a lot of players have stated in the past, Draymond is that kind of player that you hate to play against but love for them to be on your team. And for the most part, I agree with that statement. But the only thing that annoys me about him is that sometimes he can do a little bit too much. What I mean by this is his actions are so egregious to the point where it could end up harming your team. I think he got a technical foul in the first quarter. The game hasn't even started yet and you're already yapping. And I understand that it gets people fired up, especially your teammates, when you show that much passion for the game. But it's more passionate if you're out on the floor playing defense than you are running your mouth. And he is that type of player. I know he is. That's his persona, whatever have you. But at the end of the day, when you're competing for the championship, you have to realize what's more important. And what he does out on the floor is more important. So whilst he can be super beneficial to the team, in my opinion, I think Draymond sometimes oversteps the boundary of aggression and overall stupidity. So whilst I like the aggressive tone, I just don't necessarily think it's being put forward to the right places. And it could be more detrimental to the team, as you guys probably know if you have been keeping up with the NBA for a long time. He got suspended in Game 5 of the 2016 NBA Finals against the Cleveland Cavs because he hit LeBron in the nuts. Let's face it, he hit LeBron in the nuts after LeBron tried to walk over him. And what ended up happening that year? The Warriors blew a 3-1 lead in the finals and the Cavs go on to win the chip. That to me was the turning point for who comes out a winner in the 2016 finals. Obviously it wasn't the Warriors, so that's my take. I feel the same way that I do about this as I do about that 2016 finals. I personally believe Draymond is the turning point for the Warriors winning, in the same way that I feel like Marcus Smart is going to be the turning point for the Celtics winning. It's all down to their defensive performance. And if Draymond gets chucked out of the game because of too many technicals or a flagrant 1 or 2, it could be quite scary for Golden State. So finally, before we head off, let's address the controversy, mainly revolving around 2 plays. One, the incident with the closeout on Jaylen Brown, where Draymond Green threw his legs over Brown and Jaylen took exception to that. So they got into a little bit of a scuffle. The refs decided not to give a double tech because of the fact that Draymond already had a technical, so they didn't want to throw him out. I'm guessing that's what they were thinking. As much as that worked out in our favour, I think that was the wrong call. And if you watch the Draymond Green show, he explains why he felt that happened, which was essentially for entertainment value. You don't pay that much money to see people get tossed out of a game, and I do understand that. But at the end of the day, that doesn't mean that you can do whatever you like and be as chippy as you want and get away with it. So to kind of add to my previous point, I think Draymond really overstepped the boundary of aggressiveness and stupidity in that particular moment, because at the end of the day, it was his legs on top of Jaylen Brown. So why would you react that way when a player takes exception to that? All you had to do was defend your case in a polite manner. But, of course, that's not really who he is. He's that chippy guy, as I just said. The final one before we go, the incident with Jordan Poole and Derek White, where Derek White tries to jump over Jordan Poole and gets tripped on by Jordan Poole's arms. Do I think that contact was intentional? No. If somebody's jumping over me, I'm going to try and cover my face. Because if you think I'm going to get stepped on, there's no chance. At the end of the day, I'm going to protect myself however I can. And the only reason why I think this is a controversial talking point is just because of that play that happened between him and Ja Morant, which in my opinion was also unintentional. So I'm not going to dive too deep into that one. But yeah, completely outrageous to assume that he is a dirty player. But I do understand Derek White's case. Anyways, that's going to wrap up today's episode of the Swingman podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. As of the time that I'm recording this, Game 3 will happen tonight at Boston. So that video should be out very, very soon. Until then, make sure you subscribe. Hit the like button as well as the little bell icon to be notified about when every video gets released. But until then, take care and goodbye.